March 8, 1971, 9:47 p.m., Madison Square Garden. Frank Lucas walks through the upper concourse wearing a coat that catches every light in the building. Chinchilla, full length, custom tailored, the kind of fur that doesn't whisper wealth, it screams it. The crowd parts slightly as he moves toward his seat, not because they know who he is, because they can't look away from what he's wearing. Ringside, Section A, Row 3. He sits down next to his wife, adjusts the coat, and settles in to watch the fight. Around him, movie stars, senators, mob bosses everyone knows by name, millionaires whose faces appear in Forbes. Frank Lucas sits among them wearing more money than most of them earn in a year. And nobody in that arena knows how he paid for it, except the two detectives standing near the press section, 20 feet away, who just stopped talking. 6 years earlier, Frank Lucas was nobody. A driver, an enforcer, a man who carried bags and kept his mouth shut. He worked for Bumpy Johnson in Harlem, back when Bumpy ran the neighborhood the way a mayor runs a city, with structure, rules, and consequences. Frank learned by watching how to move money without making noise, how to keep people loyal without making them afraid, how to disappear into a crowd even when you're standing in the middle of it. When Bumpy died in 1968, the Italians thought they'd move in, take over the Harlem drug trade the way they controlled everything else in New York. Frank Lucas had a different idea. He went to Bangkok. Not alone, not loud. He flew commercial, stayed in modest hotels, wore plain clothes, met with suppliers the Italian families didn't even know existed. While everyone else was fighting over the scraps of the French connection, Frank built his own pipeline. Heroin. Pure. Smuggled back in military coffins from Vietnam. Or so the story went later. The truth was simpler and quieter. He found a route no one else was using. He paid the right people. He brought the product in himself. By 1970, Frank Lucas controlled the best heroin in Harlem, and nobody knew his name. He drove a Chevy, lived in a brick house in Teaneck, New Jersey, wore slacks and button-down shirts that looked like they came from Sears. His neighbors thought he worked in sanitation. His own mother didn't know how much money he was making. That was the point. The Italians wore pinky rings and drove Cadillacs and ate at restaurants where everyone knew their names. Frank Lucas blended in, moved like air, made millions while looking like a man who made $30,000 a year. Until the coat. Madison Square Garden. 10:03 p.m. The bell rings for round 1. Muhammad Ali moves across the ring like he's dancing. Joe Frazier stalks forward like he's got nowhere else to be for the rest of his life. The crowd roars. Flashbulbs explode from the press section. Every famous face in America is watching. Frank Lucas leans back in his seat. The fur spreads around him like a blanket made of money. 3 rows back, a man in a gray suit taps his partner on the shoulder. "You see that coat?" "Yeah." "You know who that is?" "No. Neither do I." They watch for another minute. The man in the gray suit pulls out a small notebook, writes down the section number, the row, a description. Black male, early 40s, expensive coat, very expensive coat. Sitting ringside at the biggest fight of the decade. "Run him tomorrow," the first detective says. His partner nods, doesn't look away from the coat. What Frank Lucas didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that half the NYPD and 2 federal agencies had people inside Madison Square Garden that night. Not for him, for everyone else. The fight was a target-rich environment. Mob bosses, bookmakers, known criminals sitting shoulder to shoulder with Wall Street executives and Hollywood actors. Law enforcement didn't come to watch boxing. They came to watch who showed up. And Frank Lucas showed up wearing a question mark made of fur. The coat cost $100,000. In 1971, that bought a house. 2 houses. A small apartment building. It bought a Rolls-Royce and enough left over for a yacht. Frank had paid cash. Hadn't thought twice about it. He'd been careful for so long. Invisible for years. He figured he'd earned one night. One moment to sit among the kings and look like one. That was the miscalculation. Kings have kingdoms everyone can see. Palaces. Titles. Histories written in newspapers and tax returns. Frank Lucas had none of that. Just money that appeared from nowhere. And a coat that made sure everyone noticed. Round 7. Ali's bleeding from a cut above his eye. Frazier's landing body shots that sound like someone hitting a side of beef with a hammer. The crowd's on its feet. Cigars and cigarettes fill the air. Champagne corks pop in the luxury boxes. Frank Lucas sits perfectly still, watches the ring. Doesn't cheer, doesn't react. The coat glistens under the arena lights. Behind him, a man he's never seen before takes a photograph. Not of the ring, of the crowd. The camera angle includes Frank's seat, the fur, the calm expression on his face. The photo goes into a file the next morning. 2 weeks later, a detective named Richie Roberts gets assigned to a joint task force. Federal, state, local. The target: major narcotics operations in the New York area. Roberts is clean, doesn't take bribes, doesn't look the other way. Other cops don't trust him because of it. That's exactly why he gets the assignment. One of the first things he reviews: surveillance photos from the Ali Frazier fight. He stops on one image: black male, fur coat, ringside seat. Who's this? The senior agent shrugs. No idea. We ran him. Nothing came back? No record? No known associates? No visible income? But look at where he's sitting. Look at what he's wearing. Roberts stares at the photo for a long time. Find out, he says. Frank Lucas didn't notice anything at first. Business continued. The heroin moved through Harlem exactly the way it always had. Smooth, quiet, profitable. His network stayed small. Trusted people, family members, guys who'd been with him since the bumpy days. Nobody talked. Nobody skimmed. Nobody got loud. But the questions started anyway. A lieutenant in Newark mentions Frank's name to a federal agent. Casual, just wondering if anyone's heard of him. The agent hasn't. Makes a note. Passes it along. A banker in Teaneck notices deposits that don't match employment records. Mentions it to a friend who works for the IRS. The friend makes a call. A traffic cop in Harlem sees Frank walking into a diner. Recognizes him from somewhere. Can't remember where. Mentions it at roll call. Another cop remembers. The fight. The coat. The ringside seat. The name Frank Lucas starts appearing in reports. Not many. Not loud. Just enough. A whisper that gets a little louder each time it's repeated. Madison Square Garden. 6 months after the fight. Detective Richie Roberts stands in the empty arena during the day, walking the aisles, trying to understand what he's looking at. He's been working the case for 3 months now, followed the money backwards. Bank accounts that shouldn't exist, properties purchased with cash, a heroin network that's too clean to be real. And at the center of it, a man in a fur coat nobody can explain. Roberts walks to Section A. Row 3. Stands where Frank Lucas sat. Looks around at the other seats. Senators sat here. Movie stars, legitimate millionaires. And one man who shouldn't have been able to afford the ticket, let alone the coat. That was the tell, Roberts says to his partner. He got comfortable. Frank Lucas didn't know he was being followed until it was too late. The surveillance was patient, professional. Federal agents watching from a distance, tracking his car, noting who he met with, photographing everyone who entered and left his properties. They didn't rush, didn't push. Just collected information day after day, building a case the way you build a wall. One brick at a time. By 1973, they had enough. Frank Lucas heard the whispers, felt the pressure. Guys in his network started getting arrested for minor charges. Traffic stops that turned into searches. Parole violations that should have been warnings suddenly became sentences. The net was tightening. He could feel it. What he couldn't figure out was how they'd found him in the first place. January 28, 1975. 6:00 a.m. Teaneck, New Jersey. Frank Lucas wakes up to the sound of his front door being kicked in. DEA agents, NYPD detectives, federal marshals. They pour through the house like water through a broken dam. Guns drawn, badges out, voices shouting commands, his wife screaming, his children crying. The whole neighborhood watching from their windows as Frank Lucas, the man they thought worked in sanitation, gets walked out in handcuffs. They find cash hidden in the walls, drugs in the basement, records documenting millions of dollars in transactions. They seize properties, freeze accounts, arrest associates across 3 states. The empire Frank Lucas built in silence collapses in a single morning. Later, much later, Frank sits in a holding cell waiting for his bail hearing. A detective comes by, not to question him, just to talk. "You know what did it?" the detective says. "The coat. Madison Square Garden, March 8th, 71. That's when we started looking at you." Frank doesn't respond, just stares at the wall. The detective continues. "You were invisible before that. We had no idea who you were. But you walked into the garden wearing $100,000 on your back and sat down next to senators and movie stars. And we said, who is this guy? How does he afford this?" That's all it took. One night, one coat. Frank Lucas finally speaks. "I know. The trial takes months. The evidence is overwhelming. Financial records, witness testimony, seized drugs, surveillance photos going back years. Frank's lawyers try every angle, challenge the searches, question the witnesses, argue procedure. Nothing works. The jury deliberates for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Frank Lucas is sentenced to 70 years in federal prison. It gets reduced later. Deals are made, testimony is given, cooperation is offered, but the empire is gone. The network is destroyed. The invisible man is visible now to everyone. In the years after, Frank Lucas gives interviews, writes memoirs, tells his story to anyone who'll listen. He talks about the heroin pipeline, the military coffins, or maybe not the coffins. The story changes depending on who's asking. The money, the power, the fall, and every time, without fail, he mentions the coat. "Dumbest thing I ever did," he says. "I had it all. I was untouchable. And I walked into Madison Square Garden wearing $100,000 like I wanted people to see me, like I wanted them to know." The interviewer always asks the same question. Why did you do it? Frank Lucas never gives the same answer twice. Sometimes it's pride, sometimes it's confidence, sometimes he claims he thought he was too big to fall. Sometimes he just shrugs and says he doesn't know. But the truth that law enforcement figured out and Frank Lucas learned too late, is simpler than any of those explanations. He forgot the first rule: stay invisible. Madison Square Garden still stands. The building's been renovated twice since 1971. New seats, new lights, different crowds. But the history's still there. Somewhere in the archives, there's a photograph of Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier fighting the fight of the century. And somewhere else in those archives, there's another photograph. Frank Lucas, ringside, wearing a coat that cost him everything. The fight went 15 rounds. Frazier won by unanimous decision. Ali took the loss and came back stronger. The crowd went home. The lights went dark. The arena emptied. And in the press section, 2 detectives stayed behind, asking one question that would eventually bring down an empire. Who is this man, and how can he afford to sit here dressed like that? It took 4 years to answer that question completely. 4 years of surveillance, investigation, arrests, and trials. 4 years to dismantle what Frank Lucas built over a decade of invisible, disciplined silence. All because of one night, one coat, one moment of visibility in a life built entirely on shadows. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, like, and share it. More stories history didn't tell you are coming next.